Some strong language now on BBC Two Scotland as Carl MacDougall continues his story on how the Scots language has developed over the years. This week, discovering how the arts and media breathed new life into Scots in the 20th century.
Scots had once been the language of kings, but by the beginning of the 20th century it found itself in the gutter, overwhelmed by the prestige and power of English. This is the story of how Scots found its place in the modern world.
MacLean.
He's up easy.
Going to do that.
I done a keen house.
Just your own voice. Speaking your own voice.
Nothing annoys me more than being told that the way I speak is somehow not good enough. And throughout the 20th century, this is what we were constantly telling ourselves. But some folk were not content to let Scots languish in the gutter. The question was how to raise it out of the mire.
Social class and Scots go hand in hand. It's a thing that's plagued Scots for many, many years.
I mean, there's nobody out there thinking I went to private school, is there?
English as it was spoken by the Queen or whatever was deemed as being correct, and therefore that sense of shame was instilled into lots of Scots. You know, you couldn't be a lawyer if you spoke like Rabsy.
Since the Reformation, Scots had been marginalised and considered uncouth by an English-speaking establishment. However, it was still the language of everyday life. 19th century industrialisation in Scotland drew thousands of people to the growing urban centres.
Glasgow especially expanded at a fantastic rate, the population of Glasgow, with the influx of people from all over Scotland, with the influx of Highlanders from the clearances, with the influx of Irish coming in as refugees from the famine.
The thing about urban society is it always sort of kind of recreates itself, it always develops and moves on. Language adapts to this type of environment.
In the mid-19th century, the newspaper press in Scotland expanded at an incredible rate. Columns written in Scots were regular features.
If you think a working man's nae better than an animated dummy, a mere hewer o' wood and drawer o' water, capable of naething else than eating, drinking and sleeping like the brute beasts that perish, submissively content to believe everything he hears, without the moral courage to investigate whether it's true or false. It's no high time he was throwing off the shackles of slavery, thinking for himself and battling manfully for his rights. His land poors and sma wages know enough to drive ony man mad. Ony man with a soul in him.
Social conditions had barely changed by the early 20th century. This was a period of huge turmoil. Millions lost their lives in the slaughter of the First World War. At home, workers' anger at the atrocious working and living conditions made the factories and slums a fertile breeding ground for the new socialist movements. Clydeside Marxist John MacLean was inspired by the Russian Revolution, which showed that the established order could be overthrown. Poverty and the spectre of unemployment fueled the radicalism of Red Clydeside, whose leaders preached revolution using the language of the streets. In 1919, 100,000 protesting workers gathered here in George Square. Fearing an uprising, the authorities met them with tanks and infantry.
The joiners and hoarders on our marching frae Clydebank. Come on now and hear him, here be our thrang to bide. Turn out Jock and Jimmy, leave your crans and your muckle gantries. Great John MacLean's coming back to the Clyde.
Socialist leaders such as James Maxton and John MacLean addressed public meetings in voices that were unashamedly Scots.
Well, if you couldn't speak to the workers in the authentic voice of the workers, you shouldn't be speaking to the workers, because you shouldn't be a leader of the workers. I mean, the working class provide their own leaders. You don't have to go elsewhere for them, and that's historically true.
These working class Scots spoke an authentic Scottish accent, a Scottish voice, which was quite gruff, unpolished, and for many middle class Scots this was something quite scary, this was something quite frightening.
Following the general election of 1918, Labour had a breakthrough that would lead them to become the largest political party in Scotland. Never since the Union of 1707 had so many Scots' voices been heard in the corridors of power. The Labour movement had always advocated Home Rule for Scotland, but the newly installed Labour MPs promptly dropped this aspiration. Many on the left felt betrayed by Labour's U-turn on independence, among them Christopher Murray Grieve, a passionate nationalist and communist. Reinventing himself as the poet Hugh MacDiarmid, he constructed a new form of Scots, which he used as an ideological and literary weapon. MacDiarmid was reacting against the rose-tinted view of rural Scotland portrayed by the Kailyard writers. The end of the First World War saw an end to Scots in political columns, leaving a vacuum which MacDiarmid sought to fill.
I was opposed to certain ideas that were current at that time, promulgated by the Burns Club of London, other bodies, to try to encourage the use of Scots for literary purposes. And I knew what they wanted. They wanted a continuation of the Harry Lauder Scottish comic sort of thing. And I was vitally opposed to that.
MacDiarmid was looking for a literary Scots because he'd be really aware of this fact that or and aboot folk are speaking it. And it's the language for work. It's the language for your exchanges in the street. It's the language for your private life, your personal life, your home life, your family life, the language you use in the shops, the language you use when you're talking to your neighbours, the language the fishermen use, the language the farmers use. But it's not the language of the academics.
One of the ways in which MacDiarmid tries to reintegrate or revive Scots is by basing his literary language very much in his own speech, but extending it in different directions into the past by looking at dictionaries like Jameson's dictionary and resurrecting words that hadn't been used before, but also, like Burns, radiating his own language geographically, taking words from different areas of Scotland, so that the Lowlands that he came up with was synthetic in a good sense. It synthesised the Scots of different areas, different time periods, and therefore was trying to create, again, a national, timeless language.
Earth's littered with larachs o' empires. Muckle nations are dust. Time'll meisel it awa, it seems, and smell nae must. But wheesht, what na music is this while the winds haud their breath? The moon has a wonderful finger for the back lill o' death.
MacDiarmid reckoned that for Scotland to be truly independent, it would need to develop its own unique national culture, and creating a language that was distinct from English was a fundamental part of that process. So for him, language became associated with independence. MacDiarmid became a founding member of the National Party of Scotland, which was formed in 1928.
I can't draw any distinction between politics and poetry. In the Scottish tradition, they're identical. They're interwoven so closely that it's impossible to stand on one or the other separately.
MacDiarmid had inspired a renaissance in Scottish literature, but in his second hymn to Lennon, he began to doubt the success of his own project.
Are my poems spoken in the factories and fields, in the streets of the town? Gin there know then I'm failing today what I ought to ha' done? Gin I cannae win through to the man in the street, the wife by the hearth, all the cleverness on earth will no make up for the damnable dearth.
I've always been an intellectual. That may be disputed, but I don't think it's disputable.
What MacDiarmid wanted to do was recreate Scots, but recreate it before the time of the Union, before you had the rise of capitalism, a sort of kind of, if you like, pure Scotland back in the Middle Ages. And again, in doing that, he not only sort of kind of makes it overly intellectual, and beyond the reach of most people. But it also doesn't actually address the fundamental political issues of the day, which were all to do with social and economic conditions.
Everything MacDiarmid and his followers had tried to achieve was immediately threatened by the arrival of broadcasting, and the voice coming over the airwaves spoke the language of the establishment, English.
Since the introduction of daylight saving in May 1916, the public have had to...
The BBC first broadcast in 1921, with Radio Scotland following 2 years later. For the first time, voices from outside local towns and villages entered the country's front rooms.
Broadcasting is a development with which the future must reckon, and reckon seriously. Here is an instrument of almost incalculable importance in the social and political life of the community, in affairs national and international.
John Reid, the son of a Presbyterian minister from Stonehaven, was the founding father of the BBC. He saw the new medium of broadcasting as a way to educate the nation, and the language of this noble project was English.
I'm sorry if local dialects are disappearing. I can still talk myself as broad Glasgow as anybody you would hear, you see. But I don't think I should talk that on the wireless.
I think it's ironic that John Reid founded the BBC in the 20s, and he came from Stonehaven, and he was a man who came from a part of the UK which is rich in dialect, accent, language, and yet he was responsible for bringing a standard to the way English was spoken on BBC Radio, which no doubt had a widespread cultural influence, not just in Scotland, but across the rest of the UK.
It's really, I think, with the rise of mass broadcasting, that you start to have this idea of speak properly. It becomes more current in the way or the attitudes people have to Scots. So broadcasting initially, probably really right up to the 1960s and 70s, was probably quite detrimental to the Scots language because people couldn't actually hear it.
From today forward, this period will be devoted every evening to the systematic performance of the works of accepted musical classics, which form what we may call the foundations of music.
Early radio broadcasting from Scotland did feature recognisable Scottish voices.
Come on, Willie. We're going down to the sitting room.
What for?
Because I'm expecting Mrs. McCotton to pay us a surprise visit, and I don't want her to catch us sitting in the kitchen.
But why sit in the kitchen? And anyway, who could it be a surprise visit if we ken she's coming?
In the early 1950s, television had the nation in its thrall. As with radio, Scots was reserved for comedy, which often poked fun at Scots speakers.
When she promised, I got up and I danced the hill and fling.
Or for couthy music shows, which presented Scotland as a rural Kale-yard idyll.
Hello, good evening, how are you? And welcome to the White Heather Club, which comes to you direct from Scotland. Hello, come on, my bonny lassies.
When you think of some of the Scottish TV programmes that you had, I mean, the White Heather Club, I mean, it was all sort of kind of hooter-chooter, sort of kind of made-up Scottishness. Or if you think of some of the films, they've all got sort of kind of either twee Highland accents, or it's sort of kind of Brigadoon. So broadcasting didn't provide many opportunities for Scots to hear themselves and to hear authentic Scots.
The romantic image broadcasting portrayed was a far cry from the everyday life of rural folk, which was steeped in the traditions of storytelling and balladry. The way of life of the folk who carried these songs on their heads and their hearts was disappearing. But one man was not content to let our oral culture die. Hamish Henderson was a communist, poet and linguist, but best known as the father of the folk revival. In contrast to MacDiarmid, who synthesised a poetic Scots, Henderson recorded the language as it was spoken and sung.
And it struck me very forcibly what an extraordinary contrast there was between the reality of Scottish culture that you could find going off and seeing folk, and the image of it as it was being projected on this state-monopolised airwaves. Everything was being softened and made, as you might say, powerless.
Brought up in Perthshire, Hamish was fascinated by folklore from an early age, and it was here to the berry fields of Blairgowrie that he came to record the ballads of the travellers and workers who followed the harvest, living with them for months at a time. Collecting songs with his tape recorder in these fields, he said, was like holding a tin can under the Niagara Falls.
When berry time comes around each year, Blair's population swelling. There's every kind of picker there and every kind of dwelling. There's tents and huts and caravans, there's bothies and there are bivvies, and shelters made with tatty bags and dugouts made with divvies.
Oh, Hamish was an enormously important person. Totally devoted to the working class and to the Scots tongue and to Scots music and to the politics.
His effect on the revival of interest in Scottish literature and poetry and traditional music is just, it's unsurpassed. It really, you couldn't exaggerate it in any way.
The berry fields became a temporary home to many in the travelling community. For centuries, the travellers had kept Scots alive. Previous collectors had overlooked the significance of these songs and ballads. I met up with traveller Stanley Robertson to ask about the importance of these traditions.
Well, that gives the travelling people their identity because they don't sing like other people. They don't play their music like other people because of a different influence, of the influence of the meadows, the fields, the air, the trees. So when they sang, they made it their own special way, their ballads. And I was brought up with this richness of culture, and this was set them apart as a people, known as a musical people. Most of the old travellers were illiterate, and they were the ones that first of all were handing down the ballads to an oral tradition. So they were giving you the old archaic words to be used, and usually the words fitted in with the actual melodies that they used. A good example of old archaic words is in Lord Lovett's Lament. You get an old word that's almost, onomatopoetic, along with a song, for example, so when he kisses the corpse, and he kissed her on the cold clear lips, and the tears they came trinkling down, and the tears they came trinkling down, trinkling. Which is beautiful, rather than trickling. Now the Scaldy folk would say trickling down, but it's trinkling down. And you could almost see the tear coming for the man and falling onto the head of the corpse. And that marks my style of balladry.
The oral tradition has been paramount in preserving the Scots language. When we lost our high literary culture at the beginning of the 17th century, what we turned towards was the oral culture. So it's song, it's ballad, it's poetry and literature based on song and ballad that have preserved Scots.
In 1951, Hamish Henderson provided the first ever platform for traditional singers at the Edinburgh People's Festival, the precursor of today's Fringe. Speaking at the second People's Ceilidh, Hugh McDermott praised the platform provided by the festival. Our tremendous treasury of folk song, he said, is a treasury that has been occluded, very largely for political reasons, from the majority of our people. Hamish Henderson introduced Jeannie Robertson, the great singer from the travelling community, at the People's Festival.
Susan sunken, young ones churning milk, and we're all blind drunk in a juryman's food.
This was to mark the beginning of the folk revival. Suddenly, folk clubs were springing up all over the place, and broadcasters took notice. Folk music, and with it authentic Scots, began to be heard on the airwaves. While McDermott's verse struggled to find a place in the affections of the man on the pavey, the Henderson-inspired folk revival gave birth to Scotland's most gallus entertainer. Billy Connolly came from the streets and shipyards of Glasgow. Drawing on popular culture, he celebrated the extraordinary in everyday life, spoken with an exuberant vernacular that had previously been dismissed as the language of the gutter.
This is a guy who's got an instinctive ear for language and how effective a certain word or a certain phrase can be. And half of his comedy is not just about telling jokes and anecdotes, it's how he uses the language.
In 1975, Billy Connolly appeared on the BBC chat show Parkinson. For the first time, the banter and patter of the Glasgow shipyards was heard throughout the UK.
He first appeared on Parky, and it was one of those kind of seminal Scottish moments. It was a bit like when Jim Baxter did Keepy Uppy at Wembley, and when George Galloway addressed the Senate committee. It became a defining moment of Scottishness.
In literary terms, the publication of Tom Leonard's 6 Glasgow poems in 1969 provided a similar Jim Baxter moment for the Glasgow vernacular.
Up comes a wee man, beats 3 men, slings out a cracker, and Lennox, well, you want to have seen him, cool as a cucumber, bump, right in the rigging, postage stamp, a rocket. That was it. That was the end. Finished.
People like Tom Leonard start to use the vernacular again. It's very important because it is almost like a rediscovery of the Scottish language and Scottish identity. And I think the real significance about that is the way that people can almost immediately identify with this, and also how it's authentic and how it rings true.
Tom Leonard had a sense that the dominant language and the dominant discourse did not necessarily have to be received pronunciation, and indeed the way he writes in Scots and addresses issues of the use of Scots language in so many of his poems really reinforces his particular point that popular language, the common idiom, etc., has as much value as the traditional norms of received pronunciation.
This is the 6 o'clock news, the man said. And the reason I talk with a BBC accent is because you wouldn't want me to talk about the truth with a voice like one of you, Scruff. If I talked about the truth with a voice like one of you, Scruff, you wouldn't think it was true. Just one of you, Scruff, talking.
One of the interesting things about Tom Leonard is in his poems, which almost try to capture with phonetic accuracy the real speech of a Glaswegian punter, he focuses on trying to give you the authentic voice of the person. Later stylists like James Kelman, give you the impression that a real person is talking, but if you take a look at the actual text, it's an incredible stylistic trick that he's pulling off.
Ah, it was hopeless. That was what you felt. These bastards. What can you do but? Except start again, so he started again. That was what he did, he started again. It's a game, but so it is. It is, man, life. Fucking life I'm talking about. That's all you can do, man, start again. Turn over a new leaf. A fresh start. Another one. You just plough on, you just fucking plough on. That's what you do. That was what Sammy did.
In a sense, James Kelman was following very much in the footsteps of Tom Leonard, or taking what Tom Leonard had done in poetry and putting it into prose. The same sort of idea, but always challenging people's preconceptions about what language is.
Tom Leonard and James Kelman proved that the urban vernacular was as good a vehicle for literature as any dialect of Scots or English. Kelman's characters inhabited Glasgow's pubs and betting shops. Ian Patterson took these same characters and invested them with Billy Connolly's trademark no-nonsense sense of humour, and suddenly the medieval Scots tradition of flyting was alive and well in the mouth of Govan's most famous pavement philosopher.
I have seen the future, boy, and it works. Oh, and what's the future? Mince. Well, you said it.
Rabsy Nisbet was hugely successful, not just in Scotland but throughout the UK. But was he in danger of reinforcing a comic stereotype of Scots-speaking characters?
I know what you're thinking, by the way. Mental Govan bastard. Ah, you're bloody right. Don't you ever forget it.
I would say that sometimes he confirmed expectation, and other times he confounded expectation. The man of pairts, I think that's what he was. He was all things to all men, or none to anybody, depending on your point of view.
Well, Rabsy Nesbitt's language, of course, was quintessentially Glaswegian rather than Scots, and the kind of words that are kind of common currency in Glasgow, you know, the scunner and the bampot and the awan bow your heed kind of language is a Glaswegian take on Scots. It's not necessarily the kind of thing you might hear in Fife or in the Borders or in Ayrshire, and certainly not in Aberdeenshire.
The use of Scots in comedy is a double-edged sword. On the one hand, you get this incredible joy and release of seeing Scots used well in ingenious comedy, and yet on the other hand, there's always the anxiety that comedy is trivial, and the idea of Scots being confined only to comedy trivialises Scots. So you do have this wonderful kind of clever, enjoyable use of Scots on the one hand, and yet this idea that it doesn't actually mean very much, or it's trivialising and stereotyping Scottish speakers on the other.
Glaswegian seems to have muscled its way onto our screens. Shows like Taggart and River City have brought the voice of the Deer Green place into homes across Scotland. But how representative of Scots is this? Where are our other voices?
When River City came out at first, the reaction to it, oh, folk didn't talk like that and all the rest. It's hello, walk down the street in any city in Scotland and you'll hear a lot broader accents than what you hear on River City, I would say.
I think the way I speak is a fairly understandable Glasgow voice, but not too Anglified, for God's sake. So there is there's a diversity of Scottish voices in the show, which I think is the way it should be.
If you'd only got off your high horse for 5 minutes, you'd see that Alana's in her heat here.
I didn't.
She's up in her room, sobbing her hair out because she feels like she's lost Aberdeen and she's now got a soul to turn to.
Well, she knows that.
And here's me thinking that you and her had something special. I was daft enough to think that you thought on her as your own daughter.
I do.
Well, start acting like it. This is making her so unhappy.
I think it's important for any country and any culture to have its language reflected back to itself in the screen industry. I think it's important in the cinema as well that we have access to Scottish accents, that we've got access to Scottish characters. I don't think River City is necessarily part of a continuum, but I think it's probably another building block in keeping Scots alive and well and part of tomorrow's culture as well as yesterday's.
I mean, hopefully River City is given an audience characters and they're hearing voices that they can relate to. You know, I think there's a long way to go in the television to get a full representation of dialects for our Scotland. I mean, I'd love to hear programmes up in Shetland or Dundee, Fifers. I mean, there's probably accents in Scotland that have never been exposed on the TV.
I think it would be completely strange if you had a country with a voice which is rich and vibrant and spoken by thousands, millions of the people in a country, and you had no programmes in it, no drama. It would be really strange. So we have to welcome the fact that there's a programme like River City, which is hearing Scots voices. Absolutely, there should be more.
The 20th century saw a great revival of Scots in literature, folk song and comedy. But outside these areas, the language was largely invisible. But it doesn't have to be this way. And next week, I'll be looking at how Scots can break out of the ghetto.
And you can see that next Tuesday at 10 o'clock here on BBC Two Scotland.